Tel Aviv is on fire, not one building, not one block, not one district, the city. Iranian hypersonic missiles struck Tel Aviv in a sustained barrage that began before dawn and has not stopped. The Fatah 3, the weapon that Israeli air defense was never designed to defeat. The weapon that compresses the intercept window to a fraction of what the civil defense model requires. The weapon that Iran held in reserve through every previous phase of this conflict and is now firing at Israel's largest city in numbers that the residual defensive architecture over Tel Aviv cannot begin to absorb. The fires those missiles started are still burning. The Israeli government has not said how many missiles were fired. It has not said how many reached their targets. It has not said what the current status of Tel Aviv's emergency response infrastructure is, or whether that infrastructure retains the capacity to manage what is burning simultaneously across multiple districts of a city of 4 million people. It has gone silent. And it has gone silent in the specific way it always goes silent when the gap between what it told its population to expect and what has actually happened is too wide to bridge with official language. That gap this morning is the widest it has been since this conflict began. Not because the damage is worse than previous strikes, although it is. Not because the defensive failure is more complete than previous failures, although it is. Because this is not a single strike that produced a single impact point that the government can describe, frame, and manage through careful public communication. This is a city on fire, and Israel has nothing left to stop the missiles that are still coming. In the next few minutes, I will show you exactly what Iran fired at Tel Aviv this morning and why the Fatah 3 hypersonic glide vehicle is the weapon that the entire Israeli defensive architecture was structurally unable to defeat even before the attrition campaign depleted the interceptor stockpile to its current level. What the shift from single Fatah 3 penetration rounds to a sustained hypersonic barrage means operationally for the 4 million people living in the city. What the Israeli government knows about the current situation and is not saying. And why this morning represents the moment that every analyst watching this conflict has understood was coming since the first Fatah 3 round proved the layered defensive system could not reliably engage it. Before we get into it, thanks for watching. Your support is what keeps this going, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you here. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so more people can follow this. Now let's get into it. To understand why the hypersonic barrage on Tel Aviv this morning is categorically different from every previous strike on the city, you need to understand what the Fatah 3 actually is, and why the word hypersonic is not a marketing description. It is a technical specification that changes everything about how a defensive system must perform to stop what is coming at it. Yet a conventional ballistic missile follows a predictable arc. It launches, climbs to a peak altitude, and descends toward its target along a trajectory that the fire control systems of an air defense network can compute, predict, and generate an intercept solution against. The prediction window is not generous, but it is sufficient when the radar architecture is intact and the interceptor stockpile is available to generate the engagement geometry needed to defeat the incoming warhead before it reaches its target. The Fatah 3 does not follow that arc. It is a hypersonic glide vehicle. It launches on a ballistic trajectory to altitude and then transitions to a gliding flight profile that allows it to maneuver in ways that a purely ballistic re-entry vehicle cannot. It can alter its approach angle. It can adjust its terminal flight path. It can arrive at its target from a direction and at an altitude that is different from the direction and altitude the fire control solution generated during the earlier portion of its flight predicted it would arrive from. And it does all of that while traveling at speeds between Mach 8 and Mach 15, depending on the flight profile and the phase of terminal descent. At those speeds, the window between radar detection of the terminal approach and the moment of impact is measured in seconds, not the 90 seconds that the Israeli civil defense model was built around for conventional ballistic threats, not the 60 seconds that degraded radar coverage had already compressed that window to after the early phase destruction of the over-the-horizon radar infrastructure, seconds single digits. The Arrow system was designed to defeat ballistic threats at high altitude during the predictable arc phase of their flight. It was not designed to track and engage a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle in terminal phase. David's Sling was designed to defeat medium and long-range ballistic missiles and large-caliber rockets along computed trajectories. It was not designed to generate intercept solutions against targets moving at hypersonic speeds on unpredictable maneuvering terminal profiles. Iron Dome was designed to defeat short-range rockets and artillery shells within a defined engagement envelope. The Fatah 3 is not a short-range rocket. The layered system that Israel has spent decades and tens of billions of dollars building, the system that was described to the Israeli public as the most advanced air defense architecture in the world, is a system that was designed and optimized for the threat environment that existed before hypersonic glide vehicles became operationally deployed weapons. The Fatah 3 is not that threat environment, it is the threat environment that comes after it, and the defensive system has no answer for it that the attrition campaign did not already remove. Iran is now firing the Fatah 3 at Tel Aviv not as a single penetration round mixed into a larger conventional salvo, but as a sustained barrage. That shift is the operational detail that explains why Tel Aviv is on fire this morning in a way that no previous strike produced. Previous strikes on Tel Aviv used the Fatah 3 as the tip of the spear. One or two hypersonic rounds designed to defeat whatever residual upper-tier interceptors remained, clearing the engagement path for the larger conventional ballistic package following behind them. The hypersonic rounds opened the corridor, the conventional rounds exploited it. The defensive response, degraded as it was, could focus its residual capacity on the conventional portion of the salvo because the hypersonic rounds were already through before the interceptors could track them. This morning's barrage reversed that logic entirely. The Fatah 3 was not the tip of the spear, it was the spear. A sustained sequential barrage of hypersonic glide vehicles fired at intervals specifically calculated to keep the defensive system in continuous engagement mode without the recovery window between impacts that a single strike followed by a pause would allow. A defensive system that fires its remaining interceptors at the first Fatah 3 in the barrage has fewer interceptors available for the second, fewer still for the third. And by the time the barrage has been running for 40 minutes against a defensive stockpile that was already at its lowest level since this conflict began, the city that system was protecting is no longer being protected by a system. It is being protected by whatever happens to be left. And this morning, what was left was not enough to stop what Iran was firing. That arithmetic is not complicated. It is the same arithmetic that has governed every phase of this conflict since the first interceptor was fired. Consumption rate versus supply rate, depletion timeline versus replenishment timeline. The curves crossed weeks ago over Tel Aviv. What this morning demonstrated is what happens when an adversary that understood those curves from the beginning decides to exploit the gap they created with its most capable weapon system, fired in its most demanding operational mode. Now let us talk about what a sustained hypersonic barrage does to a city of 4 million people on the ground, because the military analysis of the weapon system and the human reality of what that weapon system is doing to Tel Aviv right now are not separate conversations. They are the same conversation. Tel Aviv's emergency response infrastructure, its fire services, its ambulance networks, its hospital emergency departments, its civil defense coordination systems has been operating under sustained and accumulating pressure since the first uncontested strike weeks ago. Every previous strike added to the load on that infrastructure without exceeding its capacity to function. The infrastructure bent under the weight of each successive strike. It did not break. A sustained hypersonic barrage that produces multiple simultaneous impact points across different districts of the city at intervals shorter than emergency services require to complete response to one impact before the next one arrives is not a load that bends emergency infrastructure. It is a load that breaks it. Fire services responding to fires in the northern districts cannot simultaneously respond to fires in the central districts when the interval between strikes is shorter than the transit time between them. Hospital emergency departments receiving casualties from the first wave of impacts are receiving casualties from the second wave before they have stabilized the first. Civil defense coordination systems that route emergency resources to impact points in order of severity cannot maintain that prioritization when new impact points are being generated faster than the coordination system can process and assign them. That is the operational condition Tel Aviv's emergency infrastructure is managing right now. Not a single strike with a defined casualty and damage picture that can be assessed, triaged, and responded to within the existing capacity of the system. A sustained barrage with an accumulating casualty and damage picture that is outrunning the city's capacity to respond to it in real time. The Israeli government's silence about the current status of Tel Aviv's emergency response capacity is not operational security. It is not information being withheld because releasing it would compromise an ongoing military operation. It is the silence of a government that knows the honest answer to the question of whether Tel Aviv's emergency infrastructure is coping, describes a situation its civilian population has not been prepared to hear. The 4 million people living in Tel Aviv were told throughout this conflict that the system would protect them. They were told the layered defense was the best in the world. They were told that even as the interceptor stockpile was depleted, even as the radar architecture was degraded, even as the warning timelines shortened below the threshold the civil defense model required, the system retained the capacity to provide meaningful protection over the city. They were told to go to the shelter when the siren sounded. They were told the shelter would protect them. This morning's hypersonic barrage is the answer to every one of those assurances, and the government that made them has nothing to say. The strategic consequences of a sustained hypersonic barrage on Tel Aviv extend beyond the immediate damage picture and the emergency response crisis into the political and military dimensions of this conflict that the barrage has now fundamentally altered in ways that cannot be reversed by any outcome in the days ahead. Netanyahu is managing the most politically impossible domestic situation of this entire conflict. The corruption trial that continues in parallel with the Security Cabinet meetings, the pardon request that has been formally rejected, the poll numbers that have deteriorated to their worst level since the war began, the American withdrawal from every forward regional base, the closure of Ben Gurion, the strikes that reached locations the public was told were protected, and now a sustained hypersonic barrage on Tel Aviv that the defensive system he publicly described as adequate has demonstrably and visibly failed to stop. Each of those events individually was survivable for a government with Netanyahu's political experience and communication capability. The hypersonic barrage is different. It is different in the specific way that makes it the hardest event of this conflict to survive politically. Because every previous defensive failure could be framed as the product of extraordinary circumstances. Interceptor depletion produced by an unprecedented sustained campaign that no system was designed to absorb indefinitely. A strike on a specific facility that exploited a particular coverage gap. A dual-city strike that exceeded the combined capacity of a system already under extreme attrition pressure. Each failure had a technical explanation that a government with communication discipline could deploy to manage the narrative. A sustained hypersonic barrage that sets Tel Aviv on fire has no technical explanation that changes what every Israeli watching the fires can see with their own eyes. The city is burning, the missiles are still coming, and Israel has nothing left to stop them. Those three facts require no analytical framework to understand. They are visible from the rooftop of every building in Tel Aviv that is not itself on fire. The American response to the Tel Aviv hypersonic barrage is being shaped by the same withdrawal dynamic that the earlier base strikes produced and that has removed the forward military presence that previously gave Washington direct operational leverage over this conflict's tempo and trajectory. These American forces are no longer in the region in the numbers and at the locations that made a rapid escalatory response to an event of this magnitude operationally straightforward. The bounded escalation parameters that governed American involvement before the withdrawal were calibrated to a forward presence that no longer exists at its previous scale. And the administration watching Tel Aviv burn this morning is the same administration managing the political fallout of a forced military withdrawal from every regional base it operated from at the start of this conflict. The space that administration needs to maintain the domestic narrative that this campaign has been conducted within acceptable parameters is the space that a sustained hypersonic barrage on a city of 4 million people removes entirely. Rather, the fires burning across Tel Aviv this morning are not an image that fits inside any definition of acceptable parameters. And every government watching those fires, allied and adversarial, is drawing the same conclusion about the gap between what this campaign was supposed to achieve and what it has produced. The open question that a sustained hypersonic barrage on Tel Aviv leaves hanging over this conflict is the same question that every escalation since February 28th has been building toward. But it is no longer a question that can be deferred to the next briefing, the next cabinet meeting, or the next phase of the campaign. Tarek, at what point does a government that has watched its largest city set on fire by hypersonic missiles, it cannot stop acknowledge publicly that the military campaign it started cannot achieve the objectives it defined as victory on day one? Not the military question of whether the campaign should continue, the political question of whether a government that told its population the system would protect them and has watched that system fail to stop a sustained hypersonic barrage on 4 million people can continue to govern on the terms it has been governing on. That question does not have a comfortable answer. And the fires still burning across Tel Aviv this morning are the most visible demonstration yet that the government managing this conflict has run out of time to avoid answering it. Iran has set Tel Aviv on fire with hypersonic missiles. Israel has nothing left to stop them, and the government that spent 4 weeks telling its population otherwise is silent. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you being here. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If Iran's decision to fire the Fatah 3 not as a penetration vehicle mixed into a conventional salvo, but as the primary strike package in a sustained sequential barrage, was specifically designed to keep Tel Aviv's residual defensive system in continuous engagement mode until its remaining interceptor capacity was fully exhausted. What does the shift from using hypersonic missiles as a tip-of-the-spear penetration tool to using them as the sustained barrage itself tell you about what Iran had already calculated the defensive stockpile levels over Tel Aviv to be before it fired the first round this morning? And at what point does a government watching its largest city burn under a hypersonic barrage it cannot stop have an obligation to tell its 4 million civilians that the assurances it made about the system's protective capacity were wrong? Let me know below. Subscribe and like the video if you want to stay updated on this, and click the video on screen to see another one. I will see you soon.